Rachel, Sophie, Robert, Golden Gate University, Creative Mornings, thank you so much for having me. It is exciting to be here, and this is a really cool audience. I got to speak with some people earlier. I'm Nick from The Best One Yet, although, unfortunately, you're going to get half as good a presentation as typical because my other half, Jack Kramer, my co-host, is not with us. He's on the East Coast. So I'll do my best, and hopefully we can round up. So Jack and I go back a long ways, and I'll sprinkle on some context in a second. But we wanted to share with you how vibrancy is in the DNA of what we build, what we launch, what we do every single day with our show and with our podcast. So today, in the next 20 minutes, we're going to tell you how we create vibrancy, how we live vibrancy, and one secret that we've found to vibrancy. But first, like I said, and like we say on our show, I want to sprinkle on some context. So 16 years before our theme song of our podcast, Jack and I met as freshman year roommates in Vermont. And Jack and I just totally chance hit it off. We happened to have the same set of Seinfeld DVDs. They were complementary, seasons 2 and seasons 3. So we immediately knew we had a point of connection there. And we just continued to have a lot of fun in college and working in finance right after school, living in the East Village of New York, where I'd grown up. And we ended up starting something as a side hustle that started as this, Market Snacks, a daily email newsletter we would write on the subways on our way back from our jobs in finance, secretly hiding it from our bosses so they would not find out, to selling the company and spinning it back out. In fact, Jack and I, in a funny way, have experienced every element in the cycle of entrepreneurship. We've gone from a side hustle where we did literally have this need for creativity when we were working in bank jobs, to then selling it to Robinhood, the tech company out here, which brought us from New York to California, to then after 3 years at Robinhood, spinning out our podcast and our audience into our own company just to get back to entrepreneurship, to do the creative work that we love doing. And what I love about this story with Jack is that that side hustle we started right after college, outside our bank jobs, is essentially the same product that we have today. It's just been rebranded and it's grown in creative and exciting, vibrant ways. And our audience is extremely vibrant. They call themselves the Yetis and the Besties, as in the best one yet. And they voted us to win the Webby Award just a couple weeks ago for Best Business Podcast. So it's a special audience that we would not be anywhere without. And they happen to be this vibrant group. I've got to meet a couple of them, like Dong over here, who already are here today. Now, let's get into vibrancy. How about that? First, how do Jack and I create vibrancy every single day in a podcast? Well, Jack and I think there really are 3 keys. The first is a philosophy that content is king, but curation is queen. And what I mean is, how many people got a push notification from some news app today? You can raise your hand. Yeah, it's everybody. We live in a world where there is just so much content. It's essentially a commodity. So you can create great content. But the other way to really make content stand out is when you curate it. And that's where we found value, creativity, and vibrancy, is when we can go into the world and say, hey, yeah, there are 20 news stories today in the Wall Street Journal on the front page that cover every bit about the business world. But we want to curate what's interesting for our audience. So our show is 3 interesting, relevant, cool business news stories every day that don't feel like business news because we've curated what's interesting and we make it relevant to you. We're limiting ourselves to 3 stories every day. And by limiting ourselves to 3 stories, we have to curate what's the most powerful. And that's why people turn to us. Anyone can open up a web browser and read about dozens of business news stories. But the real value, we think, is in who's going to tell you the 3 that you really should know. So curation is key for us. It's part of our philosophy. Second key to vibrancy for us is the headline hammer. The headline hammer is something Jack and I do every day. Now, how many people here work on a creative project where it is months and months long, typically weeks, and it takes a while to do? Again, everyone here. Jack and I have to create a new thing every single day. So in order for us to launch a product, to create a product, and it's a podcast, but frankly, we think of every episode we do as like a song or an album. It's a creative thing we put out into the world and then we don't touch it after that. But in order to build something creative every single day, we found you gotta have a process. And our process is the headline hammer. In fact, right before Rachel introduced me, I was actually chatting with Jack doing our headline hammer. The headline hammer is when Jack and I wake up every morning, we go through about 30 or 40 business news sources from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, all the way to Women's Wear Daily, the Business of Fashion, a food blog. We're getting information wherever we can get it. We put it into a single Google Doc that we share every day. And then Jack and I go through that doc and say, hey, this is the mix of 3 interesting stories. We call it our perfect mix. Maybe a macro story, maybe a microeconomic story, a story that's in, what do we think? Oh, jobs related. Oh, what about this one? That's startup related. We'll find the perfect mix. But we need that process every single morning in order to be creative. If we didn't have it, things would just go off the rails. So every morning at 5 a.m., I wake up, I go for a run. I then jump into an hour of business news research, and then Jack and I speak every morning on the dot and figure out our perfect mix. Yesterday, for example, we covered a story on Sesame Street's creativity that hacked and grew their social media page. And we also did a story on Uber and how they're partnering with Instacart, surprisingly. Well, we found those stories, we put them in our doc, and we curated them, but we needed that process in order to make that creativity happen. Finally, and I think this one will particularly resonate with this audience, is to have a feeling. And the feeling of our show, a business news show, is brighter. Now, when Jack and I were at Robinhood, the stock trading app, they'd recently IPO'd. We'd been there for 3 years. It was really exciting to be at a tech company going through this crazy moment. Our podcast was editorially independent and ran under the brand Robinhood Snacks. When Jack and I left Robinhood and spun out to become our own independent entrepreneurs again, the first thing that we did, the very first thing, was a brand strategy. The first thing we did was engage with brand strategists and figure out, who are we? Who are we talking to? What are we really? Are we a business news show or are we something more? And what we discovered from that brand strategy is that we were something. There are so many business news shows out there, but what really differentiated us was the feeling that we gave our audience. We made them feel brighter in every sense of the word. We made them feel brighter because they felt smarter, and we made them feel brighter because they felt happier. Because when you listen to our show, there's 20 minutes every day of the best one yet. It makes you feel like you know something new. You've got that inside scoop on Sesame Street's social media strategy you can take to your job. But you also are feeling happier because you're like, hey, there's this funny story about Uber and Instacart, and Uber's launching a bus service. That's kind of crazy. So the feeling that we're giving our audience at the end of the day, with Jack's and my chemistry going all the way back to college, is our differentiator. It's a brightness feeling. And we found that to be extremely powerful. In fact, that strategy of being brighter is something Jack and I employ in every single thing we do. So when we're building out a story on how Target is hosting birthday parties as a way to kind of grow the brand and expand in a way that Walmart can't, that is a story we chose because it's brighter. It makes you smarter and it makes you happier. But when Jack and I are deciding to also launch a new product like merch and other apparel, we ask ourselves, is this going to make people feel brighter? And when we're making a business decision about closing a deal, we ask ourselves, is this deal going to make our audience feel brighter in some way? Like, everything we do comes back to this feeling, whether or not you even see what that thing is we're talking about. So to whip up the takeaways, as my co-host Jack would say, when it comes to vibrancy and creating vibrancy every day, the 3 things we think are key are to have a philosophy, to have a process, and to have a feeling. Whether you're a creative who is writing and building and drawing logos during the day, or if you're running a business news show. But Jack and I also think it's not just how you can apply vibrancy to your work, it's also how you can apply vibrancy to your life. So there are actually 3 things Jack and I have learned as podcasters we think can apply to everyone in this room. And it's funny for us because 10 years ago, we didn't even know you could do podcasting as a full-time job. And frankly, I don't think our parents still totally understand what we do as a full-time job as podcasters. Something radio-ish seems to be the response. So the first part about vibrancy in your life is that there's always a story. You just have to find it. So every day, Jack and I go into all this business news, right? And let's take Abercrombie and Fitch, publicly traded company. They've been doing great on the stock market the last couple of years. Now, if you saw their latest earnings report of Abercrombie, you're going to notice the revenues were up, profits were up. There was kind of I think a tax adjustment that they made. And if you're reading CNBC, you're going to get all of that information. You're going to get the net income, you're going to get the key data, and maybe some customer level stuff. But Jack and I jumped into the earnings call, and we read through the whole call, and we noticed this theme with Abercrombie and Fitch, which was that there was a wedding dress that cost $45 for cocktail parties that was like their best performing product. And if then you looked into their earnings financials and what their top segment was, it was women's dresses. And then when you put it together and saw where the profits were coming from, we redid that entire story. What we realized is the story isn't Abercrombie and Fitch had another good quarter. The story was Abercrombie and Fitch is getting driven by a single $45 cocktail dress. That's the story. And that's where we found a differentiator. That's why people think our podcast is vibrant, is because we're not just telling the news of Abercrombie's quarter. We are telling the story of a wedding dress that is driving an entire company that we all know about. That's storytelling, and you can find that in any job you do. So maybe that storytelling is how you describe yourself when you're doing a job application. Maybe the story you tell where you pull out that one detail, maybe it's when you're making a pitch at your next company meeting for a project you want to work on. Either way, there's always a story there. You just have to find it, and then you can tell it. Second, we've discovered there is a formula for interesting. When you want to create something that's interesting, because then it gets shown, shared, cared about. Interesting is key. If you follow this formula, you can find the interesting. So bold plus specific equals interesting. Bold plus specific equals interesting. And what Jack and I mean when we say this is that when you're describing something in a creative role or any other role, you can just describe it, or you can find the very particular intense thing that stands out. So for example, Jack and I just covered yesterday on the show a story about Sesame Street and how Sesame Street actually is a social media strategy that's become one of the top performing in the world of business, which is a fascinating story to us. Now, when Jack and I tell that story, we could just say Sesame Street, Sesame Street, Sesame Street over and over and just tell that story to you. What made it interesting, though, was finding what was bold and what was specific. What was bold was when we picked out the character names. So we talked about how Elmo has jumped into DMs. Elmo is in your DMs, baby. And that is what's driving it. That's a fact. Actually, Sesame Street decided to invest in having their characters respond to direct messages from their audience because they found that drove engagement, which also drove growth because it was like a digital autograph. When you got a message from Elmo, you would then share it, which got more people to follow Elmo, which grew Sesame Street, which has made it even more relevant. So the story was actually not just this headline news of Sesame Street and they're doing well on social media. We got bold and specific. Elmo is slipping into your DMs, and that is driving Sesame Street right now. That's how you can reframe that story that we just said you got to find to make it interesting. Bold plus specific. We actually turned that story into a very interesting takeaway, which was that not everything you do has to scale, especially in San Francisco in the tech industry. Everyone talks about scale, scale, scale. Everything's got to scale. Well, our bold and specific takeaway about Sesame Street's social media strategy was that you don't have to scale. That's bold and it's specific. And that's how you make a story interesting. And then finally, when it comes to making your life vibrant, another thing Jack and I have learned from podcasting is to be 110% of yourself. That doesn't mean being inauthentic. Being 110% of yourself is being a little bit more of yourself. Because when you listen to us in podcasting, you're listening to us. You're not seeing us. You're multitasking. You're driving your car. You're walking your dog. You're doing something with the fridge. So you don't really engage with us in the same ways when you're just staring at a TV. That means Jack and I got to like amp things up a little bit. So when we say 110% of ourselves, it means if you're just chatting, you would say, yeah, I like pizza. You know, I enjoy pizza. I eat pizza. A16, great pizza. It's good, you know. But when you're on a podcast, you love pizza. You really love pizza. It's really good. I love A16. I mean, I go there in the marina and I get that A16 pizza and I'm devouring the stuff. That's being a little bit more than just our typical selves. It's being 110% of ourselves. It's still us. We're just amping it up to get heard a little bit more. And that's something we learned on our first day of podcasting 6 years ago, and it's stuck with us ever since. We have a very intimate medium. We are in your ears. We have a close relationship. We are close with our listeners, and we love that. And one of the ways we're able to be close with them is because Jack and I aren't just talking on a microphone. Podcasting is a craft. We think about every line, every inflection, every detail on our show. Everything you hear in those 20 minutes every day, it is carefully thought out as much as it is also spontaneous. But that also means we are amping it up a little bit so that you don't just hear us, you connect with us. We're being 110% of ourselves. It's still us, just a little bit more of us. Jack and I think this can apply to your life and your work too, because it's so easy to forget that in a world where there's so much noise, so many people, so much confusion, so much busyness, you can stand out simply by taking a little bit more push to be 110% of yourself. Maybe it's in that meeting, you'll lean in a little further and you do share that thing you're not comfortable or not certain you should share, because you could be 110% of yourself. You want to be not just present, you want to be really present when you're present. And being 110% of yourself, you have to do it to have a podcast, but you also can do it in the world of not podcasting. So to whip up the takeaway, when it comes to vibrancy in your life, there's always a story. You just have to find it. Bold plus specific is the formula for interesting, and be 110% of yourself. But there is one final secret to vibrancy that I did not want to leave out that Jack and I were chatting about, and actually he didn't know about this. I whipped this up last minute on him. It's Jack. It's my co-host. It's co-foundership is friendship and beyond. You know, I would not and could not do this incredible job that we love of creating pop biz business news every single day if I didn't have my co-host, Jack, who happens to also be my best friend, 15-year buddy, and a first college roommate. I know not everyone can have a co-founder, and there are plenty of successful businesses where you don't have a co-founder. You have yourself as a founder, and that is an incredible journey to go on. I found that co-foundership is the reason our company exists today, why I get to do something I didn't know existed 10 years ago and absolutely love, and get to take a concept of business news that's not creative and make it creative. It's because of the relationship Jack and I have. So Jack and I talk about not just being co-founders, but a co-foundership. It's a deep, deep relationship. In fact, there's data to back this up. We may as well mention Sam Altman and OpenAI because they're consistently in the news, but they've done the research on this when he was at Y Combinator, that startups with co-founders tend to be more successful. This is the most important decision you make as the founder of a company. And interestingly, there are nuances to this. Like meeting your co-founder in school is a more likely successful outcome than if you just meet your co-founder because someone connected you. There's a level of trust that comes with being a co-founder. It's a friendship first and foremost. And co-foundership is the secret to vibrancy, because we cannot have so much fun on our podcast. We cannot be as vibrant unless we trusted each other, and that all comes to our co-foundership with Jack. In fact, the summer we went full-time on our company and raised money and then ultimately ended up selling it. We were taking all these city bike rides throughout New York City every day, feeding off the energy of New York together, going to all these workout classes, just living and breathing together and growing the company, building it. And it was because of this friendship. That is not something we could have done alone. Of course, you can build a company alone. That is totally fine. But I found that when it comes to vibrancy, Jack is my vibrancy. And we've been through a heck of a lot together as a result. So thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone can find a little vibrancy in their day, because vibrancy really is something that's special. It can be an energy, it can be a feeling, it can be storytelling, it can be a $45 wedding dress at Abercrombie & Fitch. That's vibrancy. Thanks so much for having me.